Part 4. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 31. Ruyi Little Man. Chapter 31. Breaking face. Tang Ning moved a chair to enjoy the cool air in the yard. She closed her eyes and noticed something approaching. When she opened her eyes, she realized that it was not something approaching. Tang Yao Yao stood beside him, looking down at him. She looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Where are you and Xiaoi?" Tang Ning was puzzled. What step? Still pretending, Tang Yao Yao looked at him, curled her lips and said, "No matter what, I can be regarded as the matchmaker for you too, right?" The matchmaker Tang Ning knew was a matchmaker, not a stoner. Tang Ning asked in surprise, "Then what?" Tang Yao Yao opened her mouth as if to question, but when the words came to her lips, she swallowed them back. "Yeah, what then? The two of them are husband and wife, the closest people. What did they do that night, and what does it have to do with her? She is just an outsider." However, she and Zhongyi grew up together since childhood. They were already good friends when they could only crawl on the ground. They talked about everything, regardless of each other. They were the best and best friends. She helped throw her hydrangeas. Their relationship of more than 10 years is not worth a month for others. Woman. Tang Yao Yao shook her head and sighed. Tang Ning reminded her, "You are also a woman." Tang Yao Yao glared at him, stopped asking questions, and simply turned around and left. But her leaving figure looked a little lonely and desolate. Tang Ning felt that she should remind talented Lady Zhong tonight that her best friend seemed to be jealous, and she was jealous of herself. She should pay more attention to this mentally sensitive older girl, lest she turn from jealousy to jealousy and beat him one day. Zhongyi walked in from outside and walked to his side. After thinking for a while, she asked in a low voice, "Should I spend more time with Yao Yao?" It seemed that she was aware of this matter as Tang Ning nodded. Zhongyi said with some self-blame, "Yao Yao doesn't have many friends. I've been too busy recently, so I've neglected her." This kind of friendship between best friends is quite touching. The two of them simply care about each other and think about each other. Tang Ning couldn't help but think of certain phenomena in later generations. There are 6 people in a girl's dormitory, and there are 8 WeChat groups between them. Yesterday's best friends, today they were fighting in the street because of stealing their boyfriends. They took off their clothes and pulled their bras. The scene was so beautiful. Tang Yajing's personality seems to be outgoing, and such a person has no shortage of friends. But in fact, her only friend is Zhongyi. She likes to dance with swords and guns, and she is not in the same circle as those talented women who are good at writing and writing. They probably look down on each other. Zhongyi is busy socializing these days, and she feels disappointed, purely because leisure. Tang Ning has already thought about it. If she is kept busy, she will stop thinking about these things. For example, she can teach her martial arts. Or, if that doesn't work, she can teach herself martial arts. It is everyone's responsibility to care for the physical and mental health of older girls. "I'm going to find Yao Yao now." Zhongyi walked out of the courtyard, turned around and whispered, "If you're hungry, just eat something first and wait for me to come back." After Zhongyi walked out, he was the only one left in the yard again. "The cool breeze blew away most of the stuffy heat and felt very comfortable on my body." Tang Ning didn't just find a movie to pass the time this time. More than a month later, his desire to go back was no longer as urgent as it was at the beginning. Of course, a very important reason is that he has no direction at all, and all his hopes have been wasted by time. Another reason is that he has nothing to worry about in another world. His parents died when he was very young, and the old dean who raised him has also passed away. There may be some indifferent relatives, but he no longer has any impression of them, and naturally he has no emotions. Although there are still many things in today's world that he is not used to, it is also another form of life, and for him, it is far from unacceptable. There is a woman who is both talented and beautiful, gentle and virtuous, a father-in-law who is not too thick but can still be regarded as a big thigh, and a home full of human touch. To a certain extent, it fills the missing and longing part of his heart. Some shortcomings and regrets can be ignored. If life could stay like this, it would be pretty good. A pleasant smile appeared on his lips and he closed his eyes again. At the same time, Zhou Mingli stepped into a certain restaurant with a face as deep as water. A few steps in front of him, a middle-aged man had just walked in. He glanced back. The two looked at each other and snorted at the same time. A waiter had been standing by for a long time. When he saw this, he immediately stepped forward and said respectfully, "Two adults, please come upstairs." There was still no one in the private room on the second floor. After the two of them walked in, the middle-aged man looked at Zhou Mingli and said with a non-smiling smile, "Is Mr. Zhou here early enough?" Zhou Mingli twitched his lips and said sarcastically, "Didn't Mr. Zhao do it earlier?" The two snorted again and fell into silence. Zhao Zhija drank a cup of tea, looked at him again, and said calmly, "Be careful with Governor Dong tonight, he won't make you happy." Zhou Mingli glanced at him and was about to say, "Just mind your own business," when the words came to his lips. He nodded and said, "I understand." As soon as he finished speaking, there was a loud noise from the door. A man walked in surrounded by several figures. Zhou Mingli and Zhao Zhija stood up at the same time and bowed their hands to the man. "Mr. Dong." County Magistrate Zhao came so early. Governor Dong looked at Zhao Zhija and said, "Then walk straight inside." Zhou Mingli clenched his fists and slowly released them. After Governor Dong sat down, he looked at Zhou Mingli and asked in surprise, "When did Magistrate Zhou come?" The officials around him looked at each other, but they didn't dare to say a word. Zhou Mingli clenched his fists in his sleeves again, but with a smile on his face, he said, "I've just been here for a while." Governor Dong glanced at him and said, "Shilang Fang has always been low-key and doesn't like to be extravagant. This time, I have visited the house 3 times before Mr. Fang agreed to the dust-cleansing banquet today. Please be careful when you speak, and don't talk to Mr. Fang in front of us, we have lost face in Lingzhou." He looked at Zhou Mingli again and said, "Mr. Zhou, in the past 2 months, there has been a life case in Yong'an County under your jurisdiction. It almost caused a plague and almost caused a catastrophe. I will be honest for a while, just stay with me sincerely, and don't speak, otherwise Mr. Fang will ask and give you a bad impression." The officials present all lamented that after that incident, Governor Dong's dissatisfaction and suppression of Magistrate Zhou had reached this level. In that murder case, Magistrate Zhou's method of solving the case was a classic, attracting all the county governments to imitate it. As for the plague in Qiajiakan, he also handled it extremely well. Not only did it not spread out of control, but he also did not harm a single life. In addition, he exposed the trick of the fake god and made it public. Within a month, there were no more charlatans in Lingzhou. These are all solid political achievements, but to Governor Dong, have they all turned into a stain? Zhou Mingli's hands shrunk in his sleeves, trembled slightly, and Zhao Zhija, who was sitting next to him, held his wrist. "Master Fang is the minister of the Ministry of Civil Affairs. He is responsible for evaluating officials. I am doing this for your own good." Governor Dong looked at Zhou Mingli and said, "Master Fang will be sitting at this table soon. There may be some oversights. You go take a seat at another table." When everyone present heard this, their hearts trembled again. It seemed that Governor Dong was completely planning to break up with Magistrate Zhou. Magistrate Zhou is the magistrate of Yong'an County. Yong'an County is located in the capital of Lingzhou and is a Shang County. His status is naturally more noble than the others. Dong Governor asked him to sit with those low-ranking officials. Among them the meaning could not be more obvious. "I'm afraid that after this time, they will also draw a clear line with Magistrate Zhong as soon as possible. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 32. Chapter 32 of the main volume of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun's enthusiastic assistant the official knows. Zhong Mingli sat at another table silently, poured a glass of wine and took a sip. Zhao Zhija sat at the table, glanced at him, and frowned slightly. Among the other people beside Governor Dong, some had regrets in their eyes, while others showed pity on their faces. The petty officials at the same table with him looked at him with less respect, and many of them were gloating about his misfortune. Zhong Mingli's expression remained unchanged. When he picked up the glass of wine for the second time, there were footsteps outside the door. Governor Dong stood up immediately and walked to the door in person. The other officials also stood up and followed him. A bright smile appeared on Dong's face, and he cupped his hands and said, "Master Fang, I have been waiting here for you for a long time." "Master Fang." The official has met Mr. Fang. The officials behind Governor Dong also saluted. Fang Hong frowned slightly when he saw the many officials behind Governor Dong, but only for a moment before he nodded and said, "We are all colleagues, there is no need to be polite." Governor Dong quickly stretched out his hand and said, "Master Fang, please come inside." Although as the governor of Zhongzhou, he has the same official rank as Fang Hong, but the central and local officials are not the same, let alone the Fang family behind him, so Governor Dong cannot help but lower his profile. After the guests and hosts were seated, Governor Dong smiled and exchanged a few greetings. Fang Hong only responded politely and didn't look very enthusiastic. Although Governor Dong was slightly unhappy in his heart, he did not dare to show it. The Ministry of Civil Affairs was responsible for the evaluation and review of officials. He had been sitting in the position of governor of Zhongzhou for many years. He had no backer in Beijing, so it was extremely difficult to get promoted. He made friends with Fang Hong. It means a lot to him. The officials present naturally noticed Mr. Fang's alienation, and couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. After all, he was an important minister in the capital and an ordinary governor of Zhongzhou, and he didn't take it seriously at all. Fang Hong took a symbolic sip of his wine, glanced at everyone at the table, and suddenly asked, "I wonder who Magistrate Zhong is." Governor Dong was stunned for a moment, then he felt happy and said, "Even Master Fang knows that this Magistrate Zhong is really outrageous." Everyone couldn't help but tremble in their hearts. Governor Dong was determined to remove Magistrate Zhong from his eyes. "What's so outrageous?" Fang Hong looked at him and said, "I haven't been back to Lingzhou for a long time, but I have also heard that Zhong Mingli, the magistrate of Yong'an County, loves the people like a son, resolves cases like a god, and is personally involved in everything. He is a man who serves the country. I've long wanted to meet a good official for the people. Why, didn't he come today? Love the people like a son, and focus on solving cases." The expression on Governor Dong's face froze, and he said with difficulty, "Fang, Mr. Fang, is there any misunderstanding?" Fang Hong frowned and asked, "Is it possible that Magistrate Zhong is not here today?" After Dong Jishi came back to his senses, he looked at the other table with a complex expression and said, "Magnificent Zhong, why don't you meet Mr. Fang soon?" Fang Hong looked at Zhong Mingli, who was sitting in the corner, and there seemed to be a flash of strangeness in his eyes. He stood up directly, walked over, and said with a smile, "County Magistrate Zhong, I have admired your name for a long time." Zhong Mingli was still a little unable to recover at this moment. After reacting, he immediately stood up and said repeatedly, "Master Fang, thank you, thank you. I have heard about Magistrate Zhong's deeds. Mr. Sun also mentioned it to me. Mr. Zhong did not hesitate to take risks and went deep into the epidemic area. He is a good official who loves his people like his own son. Fang Hong looked at he smiled and said, Your Majesty has long had the idea of purging cruel officials. He can make criminals confess without even using a single sentence. I have a good friend who is a prisoner on Jingdong Road. He has always praised this method. Some people I have the opportunity to introduce you to Mr. Zhong. Lord Fang, who even treated Governor Dong with respect, was suddenly so polite and enthusiastic to him, and even wanted to introduce friends to him. Zhong Mingli's mind went blank and he mechanically replied, thank you, Lord Fang. At another table, Governor Dong's face had turned dark. Fang Shilang ignored him, the governor of Lingzhou, but he was enthusiastic about Zhong Mingli, a small county magistrate. What did this mean? He also said that he wanted to introduce Jingdong Lu Taixing to him. Lingzhou is affiliated to Jingdong Road, and is in charge of criminal and prison affairs. It is in charge of the criminal and prison affairs of the states and prefectures under its jurisdiction. At the same time, it also supervises other officials in this road and subordinate state and county officials. It is simply hanging over the heads of their local officials. A sharp blade. Although Fang Hong has a profound background, he cannot reach out to Lingzhou, but he can go directly to the court to issue sentences on Jingdong Road. This is a person who makes people tremble even when they see him. Why are Master Zhong sitting here? Fang Hong looked down at Zhong Mingli and said, come and sit together. I have a lot to say and want to talk to Master Zhong. He turned his head and looked to the side of his seat. The official stood up immediately and said with a smile, Master Zhong, come and sit here. Zhong Mingli exchanged positions with the official and sat next to Fang Hong. Governor Dong was upset and puzzled, but he didn't show it on his face. He turned his head and asked with a smile, Master Fang, is the old lady still in good health? Well, Fang Hong replied lightly, looked at Zhong Mingli and asked with a smile, Master Zhong has been in Yong'an County for many years, right? Zhong Mingli's mood has returned to calm now. He nodded and said, it's been more than 10 years. A look of embarrassment appeared on Governor Dong's face, and he asked again, how long will Mr. Fang stay in Lingzhou this time? I will return to Beijing in half a month, Fang Hong replied casually, then looked at Zhong Mingli and said with a smile, I met Mr. Tang and Miss Zhong at my house that day. One is the most talented woman in Lingzhou, a rare young hero. He is really talented and beautiful, a perfect match. A smile hung on Governor Dong's face and he stopped talking. Governor Dong did not speak, so naturally no one at the table was qualified to speak. Fang Hong asked, and Zhong Mingli responded. The people around him were like foils, and no one said a word until the end of today's banquet. This strange drinking party lasted less than half an hour. At the door of the restaurant, before leaving, Fang Hong looked at Zhong Mingli and said with a smile, Kong Taixing will be arriving in Lingzhou in a few days. I will take him to visit him at that time. Zhong Mingli cupped his hands and said, I'm waiting for you, sir. Fang Hong got on the carriage with a smile, and the carriage gradually moved away. Governor Dong's face turned completely gloomy. He glanced at Zhong Mingli and left without saying a word. Master Zhong. Goodbye, Master Zhong. Lord Zhong, walk slowly. When Zhong Mingli left, the Lingzhou officials behind him all saluted him and changed their attitude. Judging from Master Fang's attitude towards him, I'm afraid that if Governor Dong wants to touch him in the future, it won't be that simple. Being hostile to him will not do them any good. When Zhong Mingli walked to the sedan, a faint voice came from behind. It turns out that you already had a countermeasure. My reminder was unnecessary. Zhong Mingli looked back at Zhao Zhija, the magistrate of Jian County, shook his head and said, I didn't know Mr. Fang would be like this today. Zhao Zhija showed a trace of ridicule on his face. Do you think I will believe it? Zhong Mingli said calmly, believe it or not. Zhao Zhija glanced at him, turned around and left. The moment he turned around, he breathed a sigh of relief. Wait a minute. Hearing a voice from behind, he turned his head, looked at Zhou Mingli, and asked, "Is there anything else?" "Do me a favor." Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "Help me check a person. I want his household registration and all the information I can find." Zhao Zhija was stunned, then looked at him and asked, "Are you begging me?" Zhou Mingli looked at him and said angrily, "Don't go too far. In that case, I won't help." Zhao Zhija looked at him and simply turned around and left. "Help me check if there is a person named Tang Ning in Nayan County, Tang from Tang Poetry, Ning from a Ning." After Zhou Mingli said something, he got on the sedan. When Zhao Zhija walked back to Jian County Government Office, the sky had completely darkened. "Sir," a Yamen servant at the Yamen gate bowed to him. Zhao Zhija walked into the county government office, paused again, and said, "Ask Secretary Zheng from the household to come and see me." Now the government office has been released, and the clerks in the government office have gone home long ago. The government clerk looked at the dim sky and was unsure. "Now." Zhao Zai nodded and said, "Now." Seeing that the county magistrate was so solemn, the Yamen servant immediately nodded and said, "I will go immediately." Zhao Zhija walked into the county government office and couldn't help but cursed in a low voice. "Zhou Mingli, 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 when I asked for help, I didn't even say thank you. What kind of etiquette do you know?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 33. Chapter 33, Meeting the New Moon. Again, when Zhou Mingli walked back to Zhou Mansion, he was still a little confused. Chen Yuxian watched him walk in absent-mindedly, and asked with concern, "What's wrong? What did that man named Dong do to you?" Zhou Mingli took a sip of tea and realized that the tea tasted different from usual. The aroma of tea is refreshing and leaves a fragrance on your teeth and cheeks. He is a tea lover and couldn't help but praise, "Good tea." "I'm not asking you how your tea was," Chen Yuxian glared at him and said, "I'm asking you, what did Dong do to you today? Did he slander you in front of Master Fang?" "Master Fang is the Minister of Civil Affairs. Will this be detrimental to your career?" Zhou Mingli suddenly thought that Mr. Fang also mentioned the name of Divine Dr. Sun tonight, and asked, "Did Divine Dr. Sun give this tea to Ning Er?" "Not only that, Master Fang mentioned Tang Ning a lot tonight. That night in Fang Mansion, apart from the poem written by Xiaoi, something must have happened that he didn't know about. And it seems that Divine Dr. Sun is not just a doctor with superb medical skills as he thought." Zhou Mingli, Chen Yuxian frowned, looked at him and asked, "Are you listening to me?" Zhou Mingli came back to his senses and said hurriedly, "No, madam, don't worry, just listen to me." After a while, Chen Yuxian looked at him and asked uncertainly, "You said Master Chen was very enthusiastic about you, left Governor Dong alone, chatted with you for half an hour, and was planning to introduce you to Ti from Jingdong Road in a few days." Zhou Mingli nodded. Chen Yuxian stopped talking. She looked at Zhou Mingli and shed tears. Zhou Mingli was shocked, held her hand and said hurriedly, "Madam, what's wrong with you?" Chen Yuxian looked up at him and said in a choked voice, "I know you don't want me to worry. You keep everything in your heart. People with the surname Dong are always willing to spend money. How could it not be difficult for you? Mr. Fang and you are strangers, and why am I so eager for you?" Zhou Mingli was a little dumbfounded. He wiped the tears from her face and said, "Madam, I really didn't lie to you this time. It's now, and you still haven't told me the truth." "Madam, everything my husband said is true. Real. Absolutely true." After repeated confirmations, Chen Yuxian finally accepted the fact, wiped the corners of his eyes with a handkerchief, raised his head, and asked doubtfully, "But why does Mr. Fang treat you like this? You two didn't know each other before, and there is no reason for him to be so eager to you." "That's what I find strange." Zhou Mingli shook his head and said, "I suspect that something else happened in Fang Mansion that day." "Didn't you just say that Mr. Fang knows Divine Doctor Sun?" Chen Yuxian looked at him and said, "The tea you just drank was given to Ning by Divine Doctor Sunday. I think the key to this matter is Divine Doctor Sun. Ning must know something. If he didn't figure this out, Zhou Mingli might not be able to sleep today." He thought about it and said, "I'll ask him." Chen Yuxian was also full of doubts and said, "I'll go with you." When the two walked out of the room, she paused, looked at Zhou Mingli, and suddenly asked, "You just said you didn't lie to me this time." Zhou Mingli nodded and said, "I really didn't lie to you this time." Chen Yuxian frowned, "So you have been deceived before?" "Last time you said you were going to discuss tax matters with County Magistrate Wang, and you smelled like a woman when you came back. Did you go to a brothel? That's incense. You know, Wang County Cheng likes incense." "That was last time. You said you would come back at midnight, but it was almost midnight when you got home. What did you do at that hour?" "In Tangning's room. When Zhonyi was adding firewood to the stove just now, a wooden thorn accidentally stuck in his hand. Tangning took a needle in her hand, sterilized it over the fire, and then helped her pick out the wood thorns under the lamp. He opened the wound a little first, raised his head and asked, 'Does it hurt?' Zhonyi frowned slightly, with a look of pain on his face, and nodded, 'It hurts. Be patient for a while and you'll be fine.' Tangning used the tip of the needle to pick out the wooden thorn, and Zhonyi couldn't help but take a breath. 'It's bleeding.' Tangning put down the needle and said, 'It's okay. I'll go find a handkerchief. It'll be fine in a while.' At the door of the room, Chen Yuxian grabbed Zhou Mingli's sleeve and left quickly. Zhou Mingli threw her hand away and said angrily, 'This bastard. If there's anything else, let's talk about it tomorrow.' Chen Yuxian pulled Zhou Mingli back into the room, looked at him, with a slightly red face, and said, 'Their marriage must be decided within a month. Although the two have already signed a marriage contract, they are not considered a real couple until the etiquette is completed. The step of going to the wedding hall is indispensable. If Ye's belly bulges before the formal marriage ceremony, the Zhou family will become a joke in Lingzhou City.' The anger on Zhou Mingli's face was still there, and he kept saying, 'You bastard, you bastard.' Chen Yuxian looked at him and said, 'You don't seem to be talking about that back then.' Zhou Mingli blushed, 'Madam, let's not talk about the past anymore.' Chen Yuxian frowned, 'That's not what you said back then. You said back then that you would always remember. Have it? Okay, you really forgot again.' Tangning had just gotten up in the morning when she was blocked by Zhou Mingli. The father-in-law's face was not very good, and his eyes looked at him a little unfriendly. Tangning didn't talk to him very much on weekdays, so she was sure that she hadn't offended him. Could it be that she bumped into him rubbing her mother-in-law's shoulders 2 days ago, which made him feel that her image was bad, and that made him dissatisfied with her? However, Zhou Mingli only asked him some things, mostly about Dr. Sun. Tangning's knowledge of Divine Doctor Sun was limited, and she only knew that he had a good background. The head of the Fang family was also polite to him and told Zhou Mingli all this. In addition, during breakfast, the mother-in-law took Zhonyi and whispered a few words. Zhonyi's face turned red and she ran away without eating. After that, the way Zhou Mingli looked at him became normal inexplicably. But it was the pity and regret on his mother-in-law's face that made him puzzled again. Today is really a strange day. After dinner, he walked out of Zhou Mansion as usual. An agent named Peng Chen was also waiting outside as usual. As Tangning's temporary bodyguard, he had already figured out his living habits. Tangning always had the idea of letting him compete with Tang Yaoyao. She didn't know how far Tang Yao Yao's long legs could kick this cold-faced detective away. There was still no news about the little beggar, and the old beggar had a new injury on his face. Tang Ning was slightly disappointed. As she walked back, she passed by a high gate and heard the tender voice of a child. Only pigs get so fat. Don't call me Fang Xinyu, call me Fang Xinzu. Fang Xinzu, Fang Xinzu. Just know how to eat Fang Xinzu. The chubby little girl was pushed by several children. She bit her lip and lowered her head, tears welling up in her eyes, as she lowered her head and walked forward. Several children around her age pointed at her back and laughed. She walked a few steps and suddenly stopped, looking at a figure in front of her. She was stunned, wiped away her tears, and subconsciously protected one sleeve, which contained all her delicious food. Tang Ning looked at her and explained, "I'm full today." Her hands still didn't let go of the cuffs. Seeing the little girl covering her sleeves protectively, 2 black lines appeared on Tang Ning's forehead. He couldn't understand her behavior. Did he look like someone who would trick children into eating? The little girl wiped her tears, walked away from him, stuffed something unknown into her mouth, and continued to move forward while crying. Tang Ning followed behind and asked curiously, "Why are they bullying you?" The little girl choked and said, "They said I was fat and wouldn't play with me." Tang Ning walked beside her and said, "What's wrong with Fatty? Fatty didn't even eat their rice. They said I was a pig. If they scold you, just scold them back. They also beat me. Then you call back." "I can't beat him." Tang Ning felt that this little girl might not have a correct understanding of herself. Her weight advantage lies here. Those little guys who are as skinny as straw and fall down when blown over, and who look like they don't eat well and are malnourished, will they be her opponents? For her size, among her peers, not to mention she is absolutely invincible, but she is definitely one of those who has no rival in the world. People cannot be blindly arrogant, but they cannot blindly feel inferior. It is important to recognize yourself. The little girl treated him to a lot of good food, but it was not his style to repay a favor. Tang Ning felt that it was his responsibility and obligation to help her get to know herself again. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 34. Chapter 34 of the main text of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun, Don't Bully Me. Regardless of ancient or modern times, fat people are generally not treated kindly in this world. What's wrong with being fat? Are you eating your rice? This is just a self-comfort statement. Tang Ning was not bullied because of her fatness, but when he was in the orphanage, he was bullied far more than this little girl. So he knew very well that in this situation, the more he took a step back, the more the other party would take a step forward. Tang Ning does not advocate causing trouble, but she is definitely not afraid of it. When dealing with this kind of bullying, if she takes a step back, she will keep retreating until there is no way out. "Goodbye, I'm going home." He shook his head, waved to the little girl, and murmured, "What are you going to eat when you go home today?" "Kuabeo pork, and another 60 meatballs, assorted pots." "Goodong." The little girl swallowed, looked up at him, and asked expectantly, "Can you give me a bite, just a bite?" After she finished speaking, she counted on her fingers and muttered about Kuabe Oro, 4 Zixi meatballs and assorted pots. She shook her head suddenly, looked at Tang Ning again and said, "Can 3 bites be enough?" Tang Ning shook her head and said with some pity, "But, I like brave children, but I don't like children who only cry when they are bullied." Peng Chen, who was standing not far behind Tang Ning, glanced at him twice. The little girl thought for a while, sniffed, and asked, "Then if I become brave, will you give me pot-wrapped pork?" In addition to pot-roasted pork, there are also assorted pots, 60 meatballs. The little girl turned around and walked back without hesitation. Before the children dispersed, a richly dressed young man looked at her and mocked, "Fang Xinzu, how dare you come back?" The little girl looked at him and plucked up the courage to say, "Fang Xintheng, don't scold me." "Are you still talking back?" The young man looked at him and laughed, "You are a pig, don't let anyone talk about it anymore." The little girl looked at him and said, "You are the pig. How dare you scold me?" The young man was startled, with an angry look on his face, and pushed her hard. The little girl didn't move at all, and the boy took 2 steps back. "You still pushed me." The little girl pushed him gently, and the boy fell to the ground. His butt was cushioned by a stone, and he cried out, "Beat her!" Seeing this, several teenagers shouted and rushed forward. "Ah, you all bully me." The little girl wiped her tears, crying and beating. When the teenagers were lying on the ground crying, she walked up to Tang Ning with tears in her eyes and asked while crying, "Wu, can you give me some pot-wrapped pork now?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Why don't you go back and tell your adults first?" You, then you wait here for a moment, I will go back and tell my mother." The little girl wiped her tears, walked 2 steps, looked back at him, and said, "Just wait for me here, don't leave. Come on, don't lie to me again." "Don't worry," Tang Ning waved to her, "I promise to wait for you here." "Father, Fang Xinyu bullied me." "Uncle, she beat us." "Uncle, please teach her a lesson." After the little girl took a few steps, the teenagers got up from the ground and cried and said to the middle-aged man who came out of Fang's house. Fang Hong saw Tang Ning at a glance, walked over and said with a smile, "Little brother Tang, this is." Tang Ning smiled and said, "I happened to be passing by." A young man named Fang Xintheng ran over, looked at Fang Hong, and cried, "Dad, Fang Xinyu hit me." "Who told you to always bully Xinyu?" Fang Hong not only did not help him, but reprimanded him. He looked at the little girl and said, "Xinyu, if they still bully you in the future, beat them hard, beat him hard." The little girl wiped her tears and nodded, looked at the teenagers, and said, "Stop bullying me. If you scold me in the future, I will beat you." Several teenagers were so frightened by her that they dispersed. Fang Hong looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Brother Tang, why don't you come into the house and sit down?" "No need." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "There are still some things at home." Fang Xinyu looked up at Fang Hong and said, "Uncle, can I go to this brother's house for dinner?" Fang Hong looked at her and then at Tang Ning. After thinking for a moment, he nodded and said, "Go ahead. I'll tell your mother and send someone to pick you up later." The little girl finally showed a smile on her face and said, "Thank you, uncle." Fang Hong looked at Tang Ning and said sheepishly, "Xiao Yu has caused trouble for you." "No trouble." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Master Fang is busy, let's go back first." Fang Hong looked at the freshman and the first, then another figure, not too small, left, turned around and walked back, telling the concierge, "Go to the 4th master and let him know Xiao Yu went out to play and will come back later. After an hour, send someone to the Zhone mansion to pick her up." The Zhone mansion is actually not far from the Fang family. Tang Ning and the little girl named Fang Xinyu were walking on the road and felt that Mr. Fang understood the righteousness well and had some magnanimity. The tears on Fang Xinyu's face had long since disappeared, and she began to take out various foods from her sleeves, not forgetting to give some to Tang Ning. Eaters are soft-mouthed, but takers are short-handed. After eating so much good food from her that night, Tang Ning would always feel a little guilty if she didn't give her some back. Of course, this kind of repayment is not only to treat her to a meal of 4 happiness meatballs and sweet and sour pork, but more importantly, it is to let her know herself clearly. With such a strong physique, she was bullied by others instead of bullying others. It is a huge waste of resources. She has no idea of her own strength. Tang Yaoyao and Zhong Yi were surprised that Tang Ning went out for a walk and brought back a little girl. It was a chubby little girl. More importantly, they had seen this chubby little girl at Fang's house that day. Fang Xinyu took the initiative to explain, he said that if I can beat the person who bullied me, he will treat me to 4 happiness meatballs, assorted hot pot, and sweet and sour pork. Children like to talk nonsense. Tang Ning didn't say it so bluntly just now. Zhongyi looked at Tang Ning and said angrily, she's still a child, how can you teach her to fight? You can't say that. Tang Yaoyao abandoned Zhongyi for once and stood on Tang Ning's side. She looked at the little girl and said, if you don't fight back when you're bullied, they'll get worse. Not bullying others doesn't mean you can be bullied at will. Zhongyi looked at her and asked, which side are you on? Tang Yaoyao stood beside Tang Ning with a righteous look on her face and said, I'm on the side of justice. 2-1, Tang Ning, who represented justice, won. It's not surprising that Zhongyi and Tang Yaoyao had a disagreement on this matter. Their personalities were completely different. It was impossible for Zhongyi to fight with others and for Tang Yaoyao to write poems and lyrics. In order not to trouble his mother-in-law, Tang Ning specially asked the kitchen to add those 3 dishes. He compiled a recipe of the dishes he and Zhongyi had tried, and the cook just had to follow it. Fang Xinyu was playing alone in the yard. She placed several different kinds of dried fruits and cakes on the table, tapped her fingers lightly, and muttered, whoever the little rooster taps will eat, and then threw the things she tapped into her mouth. Tang Yaoyao performed a magic trick of showing words on white paper for her. When Fang Xinyu saw the words Tang Yaoyao, the female knight, has unparalleled martial arts and will unify the world for thousands of years appear on the paper, her eyes were full of respect, and she almost kowtowed to her on the spot. Chen Yuxian and Zhong Mingli walked in from outside, and it seemed that they did not expect so many people in the yard. Chen Yuxian looked at Fang Xinyu, who was having fun with Tang Yaoyao, and said in surprise, Yaoyao, who is this little girl? Is she the child of your relatives? Why have you never seen her before? Tang Yaoyao shook her head and said, no, this little sister is from the Fang family. Fang family? Chen Yuxian's face showed a trace of doubt. Zhong Mingli was stunned for a moment and asked, which Fang family? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 35. After knowing the identity of the fat girl, the father-in-law was not calm anymore. He pulled Tang Ning's sleeve, walked to the side, and asked in a deep voice, why did you bring Miss Fang here? Tang Ning glanced at Fang Xinyu, who was sharing her delicious food with Tang Yaoyao, and explained, she was coming to our house for dinner, so I brought her here. Zhong Mingli asked nervously, does the Fang family know that you brought her here? Tang Ning nodded and said, I met Mr. Fang at the door, he knows. Mr. Fang? Zhong Mingli looked at him and asked, are you familiar with Mr. Fang? Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, we just talked a few words, not very familiar, just moderately familiar. As for his relationship with Mr. Fang, it was probably limited to the fact that he was familiar with Dr. Sun, and the other party was also familiar with Dr. Sunday. Zhong Mingli looked at him with a complicated look. He didn't know how familiar Tang Ning was with Mr. Fang, but he was definitely more familiar with him than him. The reason why Lord Fang, who had never met him before, was so enthusiastic about him last night must be because of Tang Ning. This adopted son-in-law had helped him many times, so how could he, as his father-in-law, put his face? Tang Ning didn't know what was going on with the regretful and relieved expression on his father-in-law's face. After such a long time of getting along, he knew that Lord Zhong, who was known as the cold-faced devil outside, actually had a very sultry side. In addition to the scene where he saw him flattering his mother-in-law and massaging her back and shoulders, and accidentally learned his birthday from Zhongyi, after some calculations, it was deduced that he was most likely a Virgo. After that, his personality in Tang Ning's mind collapsed. In addition to Tang Yaoyao, there was another person at the Zhong family's dinner table today. Tang Yaoyao had become accustomed to eating for free, and Tang Ning had long been accustomed to it. Fang Xinyu had already eaten 4 bowls of rice, and including the one she was eating now, it was more than the rest of the people at the table combined. Chen Yuxian looked at her with some concern and said, "Eat slowly, be careful not to choke." The little girl didn't take it seriously at all and said, "It's okay, I eat more at home than here." Tang Ning put down the bowl and shook her head. Fortunately, she was born in the Fang family. Raising her is equivalent to raising several children at the same time. Ordinary families really can't afford it. After dinner, the Fang family sent someone to pick her up at the Zhong mansion. When she walked out of the mansion, she waved to Tang Ning and said, "I'll come to play with you tomorrow." From what she said, she planned to eat at the Zhong family for a long time. The Zhong family is big and powerful, so my father-in-law must not only not care, but also be happy to see this scene. Even if this little girl is not the daughter of the Fang family, it is good to lean on a big tree for shade. With the name of the Fang family, it can deter a large group of evil-minded villains. After Fang Xinyu and Tang Yaoyao left, Chen Yuxian walked out of the room and said to Tang Ning and Zhong Yi, "Xiaoi, Ning come in." Tang Ning and Zhong Yi walked into the room and saw their father-in-law was also there, sitting upright with a solemn expression. "Please sit down first," he said. Tang Ning and Zhong Yi sat opposite them. "Ning has been at the Zhong family for 2 months." It was the mother-in-law who spoke first. Tang Ning nodded, not knowing why she suddenly brought this up. "You two should have gotten married a long time ago, but you were injured at the time, so we postponed the wedding ceremony." Chen Yuxian looked at the two of them and said, "But if we keep going like this, it's not a good idea. Outsiders will also laugh at us. We discussed it and want to get you married as soon as possible, with all the proper etiquette. What do you think?" Zhong Yi was stunned for a moment, and then his face flushed. "Mom, I'm not in a hurry," she said with a red face, then stood up and ran out in a hurry. "This child." Chen Yuxian looked at the door helplessly, then looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Ning what do you think?" Tang Ning really couldn't answer this question. Although he and Zhong Yi were no longer as estranged and unfamiliar as before, and were much closer than 2 months ago, they seemed to have not gone beyond the scope of friends, let alone love. If they continued to get along like this, would there be love? Tang Ning didn't know, at least not now. He could still tell this point. Of course, marrying such a virtuous, gentle, and virtuous woman who also had good cooking skills was what many men dreamed of, and spending the rest of their lives with her must be a very comfortable thing. If the marriage partner was changed to Tang Yaoyao, if Tang Yaoyao didn't have such long legs, he would definitely refuse without hesitation. Having said that, he and Zhong Yi had not reached that level yet. He looked at Chen Yuxian and smiled, "I still want to wait until I remember my life experience before I talk about this matter." "You two are really..." Chen Yuxian shook his head in disappointment and said, "Get married first, it's not too late to think about it slowly later." Tang Mansion. Tang Yaoyao's room. Zhong Yi sat at the head of the bed, looking a little confused. Tang Yaoyao walked around beside her and asked, "Didn't you agree just now?" Zhong Yi lowered her head and said, "When my mother mentioned that matter, I ran over." "Why did you run out?" Tang Yaoyao looked at her and asked in confusion, "Don't you like him?" Zhong Yi looked at her, opened his mouth, and said, I don't know. Although he is not very talented, he is also a little weak and stupid." Tang Yaoyao pinched her chin and said, "But he is really good to you, and he is also a little talented. In terms of appearance, he is just worthy of you. Are you still not satisfied with him?" "No," Zhong Yi shook his head, his face was a little at a loss, and murmured, I don't know." "Women." Tang Yaoyao put his hands behind his back, looked at her and shook his head, "No matter what, don't regret it later." Tang Ning only ate 2 cold steamed buns to fill her stomach at night, because Zhong Yi didn't come over at night. When she finished eating 2 steamed buns and went to get the third one, she remembered that Fang Xinyu had eaten 5 bowls of rice and 3 steamed buns today. The remaining two were because her mother-in-law saw that she ate too much and didn't allow her to eat any more. When she came to play tomorrow, she would ask her to give her some snacks, so that she wouldn't have to eat cold steamed buns at night. He didn't like it, and he had nothing to do to kill time, so he went to bed early. Mid-Autumn Festival is approaching, and the moonlight is bright. Yian County, Sujia Village. Are you sure you didn't hear it wrong? The woman's tone was 3 parts surprised and 7 parts angry. Inside the room, the man ate a hard steamed bun like a stone with green onions and said, I watched him grow up, how could I be wrong? The woman still had some doubts on her face and asked, have you heard about it? The man nodded and said, I asked several people. The boy accepted the embroidered ball from the county magistrate's daughter and became the county magistrate's son-in-law. The whole Lingzhou city knows it. This ungrateful guy, the woman showed an angry look on her face and said, how could he do this? If I had known that he was an ungrateful white-eyed wolf, my brother shouldn't have picked him up 17 years ago. The expression on the man's face became even more angry. He said he would come back to marry Xiru after he graduated from high school, but he ended up going to the county magistrate's house to be a son-in-law and enjoy the wealth and splendor, leaving Xiru alone. Keep your voice down, the woman glared at him and said, what if Xiru heard it? She's already so sick, she must not know about this. You can't keep it a secret, or else, tell her that the boy is dead. Wouldn't she be even more sad then? The voices in the room gradually died down, the moonlight was cold, and in the yard, a figure staggered outside, and almost fell when crossing the gate. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 36. Zhongyi hasn't come over to chat with him for 3 consecutive nights. Naturally, Tang Ning didn't have any late-night snacks. Zhongyi's abnormal behavior was that after her mother-in-law mentioned the church visit, Tang Ning actually felt a little disappointed, not just because there was no late-night snack. In the past 3 days, Zhongyi seemed to be avoiding him. Even after each meal, he would leave in a hurry. The previous situation where the two of them had meals and walked together never happened again. On the other hand, the fat girl named Fang Xinyu had eaten at Zhong Mansion twice in 3 days. She happily told Tang Ning that although her brothers and sisters were still unwilling to play with her, they no longer scolded her or hit her. Tang Ning felt that it might be more appropriate to replace can't with dare not. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, do you want to play with them? Fang Xinyu shook her head, bit her lip and nodded, I think so, but they dislike me for being fat and won't play with me. Tang Ning thought for a while, looked at her and asked, do you think you are fat? Fang Xinyu nodded. Do you want to lose weight? Tang Ning asked again. Fang Xinyu glanced at Tang Yao Yao not far away with a very envious look, nodded sharply, and said, I think so. Do you know why you are fat? Tang Ning asked again. Fang Xinyu looked up at him and asked doubtfully, why? It took Tang Ning a lot of effort to make her understand that it was impossible for her to lose weight if she ate so much every day. The little girl stood there, looking very shocked. She looked at Tang Yao Yao, who was fair-skinned, beautiful, and had long legs. After thinking for a long time, a look of determination appeared on her face. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, have you decided? I've decided, she nodded, with a more resolute expression on her face. She looked at Tang Ning and said word by word, I don't want to lose weight. If you are fat, you will be fat. They don't like to play with me, and I don't like it anymore playing with them. Eating and getting fat are her choices and attitude towards life, and Tang Ning is not going to convince her anymore. He glanced at Tang Yao Yao who was not far away and walked towards her direction. Tang Yao Yao and Fang Xinyu are tall and short, thin and fat. They seem like 2 extremes, but they also have a lot in common. For example, their force values are very high. It's also like they don't have any friends. So they became very good friends. Fang Xinye gave her delicious food to Tang Yaoyao, and Tang Yaoyao taught her how to hit someone in the most painful way without causing severe injuries. Tang Ning walked to Tang Yaoyao's side. "Miss Tang." Tang Yaoyao looked at him warily and asked, "What do you want to do?" Tang Ning looked at the courtyard wall beside her and asked, "Can you jump as high as the courtyard wall?" Tang Yaoyao jumped up, stood on the courtyard wall, looked at him condescendingly, and asked, "What's wrong?" Tang Yaoyao jumped onto the courtyard wall in an elegant manner. Tang Ning could see clearly that she stood there and jumped to the top of the wall with a slight jump. Tang Ning didn't remember clearly what the upper limit of a human's ability to jump on the spot was, but she was certain that it didn't exceed 2 meters. And this courtyard wall is definitely more than 2 meters long. Tang Yaji actually set a world record so easily, and it seems that he still has room for success. In such a world, what reason does he have for not learning martial arts? If I start learning martial arts now, how long will it take for me to jump as high as you? Tang Ning decided to ask politely. Tang Yaoyao jumped down from the wall, looked at him and asked, "Do you want to learn martial arts from me?" In fact, it was not necessary to learn martial arts from anyone, but Tang Ning knew that there were only two people who knew martial arts. One was the dead-faced man who followed him all day long and couldn't come up with 4 words for a long time, and the other was Tang Yejing. Among the two people, Tang Ning would rather choose the latter. Tang Yaoyao crossed her arms and looked at him jokingly, saying, "You want to learn, but I don't necessarily want to teach. If you teach me martial arts, our previous grudges will be wiped out." "Really? Really? Tomorrow morning, wait for me here. Sun Monkey has great supernatural powers, can go up to heaven and down to earth, and is omnipotent. Even if he somersaults thousands of miles away, he cannot climb over the Tathagata's 5 Fingers mountain. Tang Yejing has great martial arts skills, a pair of beautiful legs, and can kick people 10 meters away. She has never been afraid of anything except ghosts, but she also has shortcomings in her character. She has a strong sense of responsibility." Until now, even though Tang Ning had comforted her countless times, she was still worried about his amnesia. Instead of comforting her with words, it would be better to let her atone for her sins through actions. The best of both worlds, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. With these thoughts in Tang Ning's mind, Chen Yuxian walked out of the room, looked at him and said, "Ning, I made an appointment with a tailor yesterday to make 2 new clothes for you and Xiao Yi. Now you two go to the cloth shop to take measurements." Bar. Tang Ning nodded and said, "Okay." When the two of them walked out of the Zhou mansion, Zhou Mingli walked out of the room and asked, "What happened to them these days?" "They had a fight. They didn't see each other for several nights." "What do you know?" Chen Yuxian glanced at him and said, "Young man, if there is a quarrel at the head of the bed and another at the end of the bed, just wait and see." Zhou Mingli looked outside and said, "If he bullies Yi, I can't spare him." Chen Yuxian waved his hand and said, Okay, don't worry about this matter. How about the matter that I asked you to ask Zhija to investigate?" "I've already told him, you don't know how to be affectionate, you are not familiar with each other." Okay, if you say you won't scream, you won't scream. Will Magistrate Zhao help you check?" "Don't worry, he's just a tough talker and says he won't help. Maybe he's been found out now." "Miss, uncle." The concierge of the Zhou mansion had just seen off the young lady. When he looked up, he saw another sedan parked in front of the gate. A middle-aged man walked out of the sedan, stood in front of the Zhou mansion, and said, "Let Zhou Mingli come out to see me." The awkwardness between Tang Ning and Zhou Yi returned to the beginning. "I had nothing to say before, but now I don't know where to start." The two of them were silent all the way until they measured the clothes and came out of the cloth shop. "Hey, Xiaoi, what a coincidence," You are here too. Tang Ning turned around following the familiar voice and saw a woman named Hu Jin whom she had met at Fang Mansion that day, and several other women walking from a nearby shop. Then, there was a cold and moist feeling on his wrist again. Zhongyi held his arm, looked at Hu Jin and others, and said with a smile, "Let's come here to measure the clothes." "Sister Hu, is the hairpin on your head a new one? It's so beautiful." "Really, I just bought this." "Why didn't Xiaoi come to yesterday's poetry meeting?" "I am at home with my husband, so how can I attend a poetry party?" Hu Jin and others came over, said a few words to her, joked a few words, and then said with a smile, "Let's go in and take a walk, so I won't disturb you anymore." After separating from Hu Jin and others, Zhongyi didn't let go of his hand. Tang Ning looked down at him with confusion in her eyes. Zhongyi looked up at him. At the moment when she held his arm, all the hesitation and confusion in her heart in the past few days seemed to have disappeared. She took a deep breath, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, "What do you want to eat tonight? I'll cook it for you." Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, feeling a little surprised. After she came to her senses, she nodded and said, "Whatever, I like everything you do anyway." Zhongyi looked at him, a hint of shyness appeared on his face, and his pretty face was so bright that it attracted countless pedestrians on the street to stop. The vendor pushing the cart was distracted for a moment and accidentally bumped into a pedestrian. He hurriedly put down the cart and said, "Girl, are you okay?" The girl fell in front of her, and Zhongyi was startled. He leaned down, helped the woman up, and asked with concern, "Girl, are you okay?" The woman in the plain skirt looked pale and bloodless. She looked at her and looked at Tang Ning, and she couldn't look away anymore. Zhongyi looked at her and said doubtfully, "Girl, girl." The woman came back to her senses, subconsciously took a few steps back, and said hurriedly, "No, it's okay." She turned around and left in a hurry, never looking back. The hawker shook his head and complained, "She just stood there and didn't know what she was looking at. She didn't know how to give way to the car when it came." Zhongyi glanced doubtfully in the direction she was leaving, then put her arm around Tang Ning's arm again and said with a smile, "Let's go back." Tang Ning looked back from the direction where the woman disappeared, but a trace of depression in her heart could not be shaken off. He nodded and said, "Go back." On the street, the woman was walking aimlessly, her face was extremely pale, and she was walking aimlessly. Her eyes were blank and out of focus, as if her soul had been pulled out. Two figures walked past her. That was Miss Zhong just now. She is really both talented and beautiful. The person next to her is probably the Zhong family's uncle. I don't know how lucky she is to be able to marry the most talented woman in Lingzhou. Not necessarily. I heard that he was hit in the head by a hydrangea that day and was beaten for no reason. He even forgot who he was. How can this be considered good luck? The figures of the two people gradually moved away, and the woman in the jade skirt paused. She stood there for a long time, then turned her head and ran forward quickly. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were filled with an unprecedented look. Her body was already weak, and she was panting heavily and walking faster, until the two figures in front of her appeared in her eyes again. For the fastest updated and error-free novel reading, please visit and bookmark this site to read the latest novels. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 37. Zongfu. Zhao Zhija sat down at the table, looked at Zhong Mingli, and asked, "Why, the distinguished guest came to the door, and he didn't even get a cup of hot tea." Dignified guest, Zhong Mingli looked at him, snorted coldly, and said, "Over the years, you have not made any progress in other areas, but you have become thicker and thicker. In that case, Zhao takes his leave." Zhao Zhija stood up and said, "Go check the identity of your uncle." Zhong Mingli was stunned and asked hurriedly, "Have you found out? Is this important?" Zhao Zhija glanced at him and said, let's go. At least we can have a cup of hot tea at home. Tea. Zhou Mingli looked at the maid waiting at the side and said, bring out the pot of good tea in my study. The tea was steaming and exuding a refreshing fragrance. Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, did you find it? Zhao Zhija sat down again, glanced at him indifferently, and asked, over the years, you have not made much progress in other areas, and your mind has become more and more confused, you don't even know his identity, where he lives, or whether he is married. Knowing that, you dare to marry Xiaoi to him? Is he already married? Zhou Mingli's expression changed, he stood up suddenly and asked loudly. That's not true. Zhao Zhija shook his head, looked at him, and said, some time ago, there was a missing person case under my jurisdiction. I searched for it for a long time but couldn't find it. But I didn't know that it was lost to your Zhou family. Zhou Mingli breathed a sigh of relief and murmured, it's fine that we're not married yet. Zhao Zhija took a sip of tea, shook his head again, and said, I just heard this morning. Some time ago, a young girl came to the county government office every day to inquire about him. You might as well take a guess, she is your uncle's wife. Sister or sister? Zhou Mingli slammed the table and said angrily, can you finish it in one go? Zhao Zhija took a sip of tea and said calmly, I have sent people to conduct a detailed investigation. Tang Ning, a native of Sujia village, was supposed to take the state examination in September this year. 2 months ago, when he went to the state city to register, he disappeared inexplicably and has not been heard from since. If you hadn't hidden your uncle so well and didn't even reveal his name, you wouldn't have found him until today. Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, his surname is Tang, why is he from Sujia village? Zhao Zhija put a few pieces of paper on the table and said, his household registration is in Sujia village. He was an abandoned child picked up by a farmer in Sujia village 17 years ago. Zhao Zhija looked at him and added, the farmer also has a daughter who grew up with him. He put down the teacup, thought for a while, and said, let me guess, the two of them grew up together and must have been childhood sweethearts. The farmer and his wife raised him up. After they passed away, the woman raised silkworms and spun silk, washed clothes for wealthy families, and provided him with education. Although they were not married, it is said that the farmer and his wife raised him as an uncle from the beginning. Are you done? Zhou Mingli finished reading the household registration information in his hand, looked at Zhao Zhija, and said, let's go now. As soon as he finished speaking, he looked out the door and said, Qing take the tea away. Zhao Zhija looked at him and asked, there's no need to burn bridges like this, right? Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, are you here to see me having fun today? You really guessed it right. Zhao Zai nodded, looked around again, and asked, where's Yuxian, why didn't you come out today? We haven't seen each other for a long time. Why are you meeting? You called Yuxian too. Zhou Mingli stood up and said angrily, Qing see you off. Zhao Zhija frowned and said, Zhou Mingli, you can't be like this, back then. Back then, you had the nerve to mention that year. Zhou Mingli raised his eyebrows and looked at him, if it hadn't been for you. If it hadn't been for me, would you have captured your wife in 3 days? Zhao Zhija looked at him, shook his head and said, Zhou Mingli, your biggest shortcoming is your mother-in-law and mother-in-law. You are undecided and have a vague attitude. It was the same then and it is the same now. If you had been more decisive, could Xiaoi be forced to marry by Governor Dong? Zhou Mingli was speechless. If someone is not welcome, there is no point in staying here shamelessly. Zhao Zhija glanced at Zhou Mingli, picked up a wooden box on the table, and said, this tea is good, I took it. Zhao Zhija walked out of the room. Zhou Mingli ignored him, felt sorry for his tea leaves for a while, sat down again, rubbed his brows, and said with a headache, childhood sweethearts. Tang Ning noticed that the familiar feeling between him and Zhongyi had returned. She walked all the way back without letting go of his arm. She turned to look at Tang Ning and asked, "Do you want Yao Yao to teach you martial arts?" Tang Ning nodded and asked, "Is her martial arts powerful?" "I don't know." Zhongyi shook his head and said, "However, since we were young, as long as she was around, no one would dare to bully us." Tang Ning didn't know how powerful martial arts in this world were, but the scene of Tang Yao Yao jumping onto the courtyard wall with a single leap still deeply shocked him. If you learn this trick, it will be easy to climb over eaves and climb over walls to pick flowers. I'm free anyway, so I might as well learn one more move from her to strengthen my body. Besides, learning some kung fu is a good way to be prepared, maybe it will be useful someday. Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "However, I can only practice during the day, not at night, otherwise I'll be hungry in the middle of the night." Zhongyi looked at him and smiled, "It's okay, if you're hungry, I'll cook for you." Tang Ning smiled and said, "Then it's settled." Zhongyi nodded and said, "It's settled." Zhongyi had a faint smile on his face. When he walked to the door of Zhong's house, he seemed to have made a decision. He took a deep breath, suddenly turned his head to look at him, and said, "Actually, I..." Before she finished her words, there was a burst of hurried footsteps behind them. Then there was a woman's slightly trembling voice. "Brother Xiaoning." Tang Ning turned around and saw the woman she had just met standing a few steps behind them. The woman was wearing a cloth skirt with patches on the hem. Her face was pale, a sickly pale, with sweat on her forehead. It seemed that she had been running all the way here. Her breathing was a little rapid. She stood there, staring at Tang Ning blankly. Tang Ning looked at the woman and asked in confusion, "Are you calling me?" His voice was also trembling a little, because when he saw the woman, he felt a sense of familiarity from the depths of his soul, and when he saw her pale face, he couldn't help but feel a strong pity. "There is a small scar on your left arm. You accidentally burned it 3 months ago." The woman looked at her, stretched out her left hand, pointed to a certain position on her wrist, and said with a smile. Tang Ning's body shook slightly. He rolled up the sleeve of his left hand. Above his wrist, where the woman's finger was pointing, there was a burn scar the size of a grain of rice. The scar was very small. He accidentally discovered it when he was taking a shower a few days ago. As if realizing something, Zhongyi's face began to turn slightly pale. The woman looked at him and continued, "There is a shallow scar the size of a copper coin on your right arm. You have had it since childhood." Tang Ning did not continue to roll up his sleeves. The scar was almost at his shoulder. Although it was very shallow, it was still clearly visible. Zhongyi saw the answer from Tang Ning's face. She slowly let go of Tang Ning's hand and her face became even paler. Tang Ning looked at the woman, "Girl, you..." The woman looked at him, took a deep breath, smiled and said, "Brother Xiaoning, I finally found you." After she said this, she breathed a sigh of relief and fell to the ground. Tang Ning hurried forward, supported her, and said anxiously, "Girl, girl." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 38. Dr. Sun's medicine house was not far from the city. Tang Ning asked Peng Chen to drive a carriage to the city to invite him and took the fainted woman back to the Zhong mansion. Zhongyi and he stayed by the bed. She looked at the woman lying on the bed with concern, then looked at Tang Ning and whispered, "What the girl just said." Tang Ning looked complicated and nodded, "It's all true." He always knew in his heart that his current body in this world would not jump out of a crack in the stone. He must have relatives and friends. The 2 scars on his body were not even noticeable to him, let alone others. The pale-faced woman lying on the bed must be a very important person to him. She just called herself Little Ning brother. Could it be that this body was originally called Ning, or was it Tang Ning? And what is her identity? His sister? Or something else? For example, wife. Or, a wife who has not married yet? Or maybe, a child bride? Does he have any other relatives here? Based on this name alone, Tang Ning couldn't guess. Peng Chen was very fast and came back soon. He was carrying Dr. Sun's medicine box. Dr. Sun walked in quickly from outside. After a while, Dr. Sun took his hand away from her wrist, and Tang Ning asked hurriedly, "Old Sun, what happened to her?" "She is very weak." Old Sun shook his head and said, "She is depressed and thinking too much, and she is weak to begin with. She can't bear the great joy or sorrow." Tang Ning seemed to remember something and asked hurriedly, "Didn't you give me the great Huan last time? Is it useful?" Dr. Sun shook his head and said, "The great Huan is a holy medicine. In critical moments, it has the effect of prolonging life and resurrecting the soul. This girl is just too tired. There is no need to waste a great Huan, as long as she cultivates diligently." Tang Ning asked, "Is the great Huan useful?" Dr. Sun was stunned and nodded, "It is useful. Taking a great Huan will be of great benefit to her body." When Tang Ning took out the bottle of the great Huan, he saw Dr. Sun inserting a silver needle into the woman's wrist and gently turning it. Her long eyelashes trembled, and she slowly opened her eyes. The confusion on her face turned into panic the next moment. She hurriedly sat up from the bed and said in a lost voice, "Brother Xiaoning." Tang Ning came over, handed her a pill, and said, "Take this pill first." She looked at Tang Ning, her expression was calm, and after coming to her senses, she nodded slightly and swallowed the pill. Zhongyi looked at the woman who had woken up and had been looking at Tang Ning, lowered her head, and slowly left the room. Tang Ning helped the woman sit up, leaned against the head of the bed, pointed at his head, and said awkwardly, "I'm sorry, I got hurt here a few days ago, and I forgot a lot of things, including what my name is." "Your name is Tang Ning." The woman looked at him and said seriously, "Tang in Tang poetry, Ning in a Ning." It seems that Tang Ning's guess was right. Having the same name and surname, this is probably the first law of time travel taught to him by those melodramatic authors. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, then, "What's your name?" "My name is Su. Are you?" The woman looked at him and said seriously, "When Dad picked you up, your name was written on the piece of cloth in your arms. It doesn't matter if you forget my name, but you must remember your own name. It is the only thing your family left you." Tang Ning was stunned and asked uncertainly, "Picked up?" Zhongyi walked out of the room, and Chen Yuxian and Zhong Mingli came to greet him at the same time. Chen Yuxian asked with concern, "How is the girl?" Zhongyi smiled and said, "She has woken up. Dr. Sun said that it is okay. Just rest more." Chen Yuxian paused, then looked at her again and asked, "What is the identity of that girl? What is her relationship with Ning Er?" "I don't know yet." Zhongyi shook her head. Zhong Mingli had a complicated expression and said, "Let's talk about it later." Tang Yaoyao walked in quickly from outside, looked at Zhongyi, and asked anxiously, "Xiaoi, what happened?" In the room, Tang Ning stared blankly in a certain direction. "This girl named Su Ru is not his sister. She is not his wife either. It turns out that he was picked up. In the previous life, his parents died early. In this life, he was simply abandoned at birth. What is his fate? Su Ru's parents picked him up outside and raised him up. His adoptive father and mother passed away a few years ago. When he came to the state capital to register for the state exam 2 months ago, he never went back. There were many things that Su Ru didn't tell him. For example, looking at her dress, clothes and thorn skirt, even the hairpin on her head was made of wood, her family must not be very well off. How did such a family support a scholar? Su Ru's parents died a few years ago, how did he continue to study during this period? Tang Ning was just wondering if this girl was the child bride found by his parents in this world. After all this time, he himself was the child bride. Suaryu looked at the light white mark on his forehead that was almost invisible, and said softly, "Does it still hurt?" "It doesn't hurt for a long time." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "I just forgot a lot of things." "It must have been painful at that time." Suaryu's eyes were a little wet, looking at Tang Ning, and said, "Who is so cruel?" Tang Yao Yao, who had just stepped into the room, took back one foot. Suaryu looked at him, a trace of determination appeared on his pale face, and said, "Brother Xiaoning, don't worry, I will definitely make you remember the past." Tang Ning knew very well that he had even changed his soul, and some things were destined to be impossible to remember. Even if he remembered, it would be meaningless. Although they had the same name, he was no longer that Tang Ning. He still showed a smile on his face, nodded slightly, and said, "You should have a good rest first, there is no rush for this matter." He helped Suaryu lie down and slowly walked out of the room. In the yard, many people were waiting for him. Zhou Mingli handed over a few pieces of paper and said, "This is your household registration information that the Yian County magistrate just sent over." Tang Ning took it and looked at it. Yian County, Sujia Village, Tang Ning. It was exactly the same as what Suaryu said just now. Chen Yuxian looked at him and asked worriedly, "Is the girl okay?" Mr. Sun said it's okay. Tang Ning shook his head and said, "I'll let her rest in the room first." Chen Yuxian nodded and said, "It's good that she's okay, it's good that she's okay." Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, "There's still a month before the state exam, are you sure?" Not to mention that there's still a month before the state exam, even if there's still a year, he's not sure. It's not that he's not sure, it's that he's not interested. He has no idea what the imperial examination will be about, although there's a function similar to a human camera, and things that can be memorized by rote can be passed in one go, which can save nearly 90% of the effort of others. It's needless to say that poetry, he can't write it, and he can't copy it, and it's okay for the questions and the like. After all, there's historical experience first, and many things can be viewed with a forward-looking perspective. But what would it matter if he passed the exam? Like his father-in-law, he was busy with various chores every day, and it was difficult for him to even have a meal with his family. He also had to deal with the intrigues in the officialdom all the time. Tang Ning felt tired just thinking about it. He looked at Zhou Mingli and shook his head and said, "I can't remember anything about the exam." Zhou Mingli sighed and said, "The next time, you have to wait until 3 years later." Tang Yao Yao bit her lip and clenched her fists. 3 years is 3 years. When you passed the exam, you were already in your 20s. Chen Yuxian glared at him, looked at Tang Ning, and asked tentatively, "Ning who is that girl to you?" "Little Ning is my brother." The door was pushed open, and Suaryu walked out. Her face was still pale, but she was full of smiles. She bowed and said, "Suaryu greets uncle and aunt." She looked at Zhonyi again and smiled, "Meet sister-in-law." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 39. Chen Yuxian looked at her and said hurriedly, "Girl, your body is not recovered yet, why did you come out? Go back and rest quickly." "It's okay." Suaryu looked at her and smiled, "I feel much better now." Chen Yuxian held her hand and said, "Dr. Sun said that your body is weak and your bones are weak. You will be recuperating in the Zhone mansion these days." Suaryu shook her head and said, "I'm really out of the way. I'll go back in a while. Otherwise, my uncle and aunt at home will be worried." Chen Yuxian frowned and said, "How can this be done?" "I feel relieved knowing that brother Xiaoning is fine." She looked at Zhonyi and said with a smile, "Sister-in-law is so beautiful, and she and brother Xiaoning are a perfect match." Zhonyi's face turned red, she lowered her head and said, Sister Zairu is also very beautiful. Suaryu lowered her head and whispered, I am far behind my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law is still a talented woman. I haven't even read a book. Chen Yuxian interrupted, don't stand here, go in and talk. Suaryu sat on the bed and Chen Yuxian sat on the head of the bed and asked with a smile, Xiao are you, who else is in your family now? Suaryu said, after my parents passed away, it was just me and brother Xiaoning. Chen Yuxian looked at her with some distress and asked, you must have had a hard time in the past, right? Suaryu showed a smile on her face and said, it's not that hard. If we have any difficulties on weekdays, our third uncle and third aunt will help us. Chen Yuxian nodded and said, I have to thank them properly in the future. Mother-in-law and Suaryu were chatting about home affairs inside. Tang Ning took out pen and paper, and Dr. Sun wrote a prescription. He gave it to Peng Chen and asked him to help him get the medicine. Go to Tang's pharmacy. Tang Yaoyao looked at Peng Chen and said, just say I asked you to go. Just listen to Miss Tang. Tang Yaoyao's family is also in the medicinal materials business. If you give her name, at least you won't encounter deception, abduction, or shoddy goods. Tang Yaoyao touched him with her shoulder and asked, is this girl your sister? Tang Ning nodded and shook her head. Tang Yaoyao wondered, what does this mean? Have no idea. Tang Ning couldn't explain clearly what the relationship between Suaryu and his predecessor was, but one thing he was sure of was that their relationship was definitely not like an ordinary brother-sister relationship as she said. He's a little confused now. Very messy. He is not that Tang Ning. The Tang Ning in this world is dead, but he is indeed alive with his body. The person related to this body is Suaryu, and the person related to the soul is Zhongyi. He felt that he encountered a complex ethical problem. They chatted in the room for a while, and Suaryu wanted to go back. Mother-in-law and Zhongyi tried to persuade her for a long time, but they didn't keep her. Tang Ning asked Divine Dr. Sun that the effect of the Great Return pill would slowly come into play. She only needed to rest, and no longer needed any supplements. He couldn't defeat Suaryu, so he had to send her back in person. Sujia village is more than 30 miles away from Lingzhou city. For normal people, it takes about 3 hours on foot. It only takes more than 6 hours to go back and forth, which is 3 hours. Tang Ning sat on the carriage, looked at Suaryu and asked, in the past 2 months, have you walked here and back every day? Suaryu nodded. Thinking that she, a weak woman, had to go from Sujiakan to Zhoucheng and back again every day, a round trip of more than 60 miles, Tang Ning's heart tightened involuntarily, and she changed the subject and said, Zairu, tell me about our past. Bar. Suaryu looked up at him with a smile on her face and said, Brother Xiaoning used to call me that. Brother Xiaoning was so smart in the past. The teacher at the private school said that you will definitely win the first prize in the future. As she spoke, she looked at Tang Ning worriedly and said, Brother Xiaoning, don't worry. If you miss after passing the state exam, and next time, you will definitely be able to remember what happened in the past. It's okay. Tang Ning smiled and said, if you have another chance in the future, you should sleep for a while and I'll call you when you get to the village. Suaryu nodded and closed her eyes obediently. A carriage slowly drove into Sujia village, causing the villagers to go out to watch. Carriages are not a rare thing and are often seen in the city. However, except for Zheng's family, no one in the village owns a carriage. The carriage that drove into the village today looked even more impressive than the one at Zheng's wife's house. I saw someone getting out of the carriage from a distance, and someone exclaimed, Isn't that Xiao are you? Why did she get off the carriage? That's Xiaoning, Xiaoning is back too. Why are there officials around them? What's going on? The villagers gathered around the carriage from a distance and pointed. Xiao are you, you're back. In the yard, a middle-aged man walked out of the house. When he saw Suaryu, His face just showed joy. When he glanced at Tang Ning beside her, his joy turned into anger. He said loudly, "Tang, you ungrateful white-eyed wolf, you still have the nerve to come back." Su Ryu's face turned pale, and she hurriedly took 2 steps forward and said, "Third uncle, listen to me, brother Xiao Ning is really not what you think." After a moment, the man had a suspicious look on his face. He circled Tang Ning a few times and asked in disbelief, "Do you really not remember anything?" Tang Ning nodded. The man's eyes widened, "You don't even remember me?" Tang Ning looked at him and asked doubtfully, "Are you?" "I'm your third uncle." The big man looked at him with wide eyes and couldn't believe it. "You have even forgotten me. Why are you so heartless? Last year you fell ill in the middle of the night and I carried you for 30 miles. Lu, if it weren't for me, you would have." "Third uncle." Su Ryu walked over quickly and said, "Brother Xiao Ning just forgot now, but he will remember it later." Tang Ning looked at him with an awkward expression on her face and said, "Uncle Third." The big man waved his hand very generously and said, "Forget it, you are confused, I won't argue with you." A woman stood behind the big man and looked at him and said happily, "It's good to be back. It's good to be back. You don't know how worried Zairu was during your absence. Hey, who do I think it is? It turns out that our great talent from the Tang dynasty is back." The courtyard door was suddenly pushed open, and a figure walked in from the door. The woman's expression changed and she said hurriedly, "Master Chong, why are you here?" The richly dressed fat man held a folding fan in his hand and fanned it vigorously. The fat on his face shook a few times. He smiled and said, "I haven't seen the great talent of Tang dynasty for a long time. I miss you. I got the news. I will immediately came here." "Who is he?" Tang Ning looked at the fat man and asked. The fat man was startled and asked, "You don't know who I am?" He laughed, put away the fan, pointed at him, and said, "We grew up together. You don't know who I am? Are you stupid because of studying?" The woman hurriedly stepped forward and said, "Master, Xiao Ning was injured a few days ago and has forgotten some things. Don't be offended, don't be offended. I'm really stupid for reading." The fat man weighed the folding fan in his hand, looked at Tang Ning and said, "The land your family cultivates belongs to our family, and you don't know who I am." He looked at Su Ryu, shook his head, and said, "Xiao Ryu, you are serious? What's the point of marrying a fool? Why not marry me? You will have endless glory and wealth in the future." The woman tugged on Tang Ning's sleeve and said, "He is the son of Yuan Zheng, and less than half of the land in Sujia village belongs to Yuan Zheng's family." Tang Ning became even more confused and asked, "Who is Mr. Zheng?" There was a trace of anger on the fat man's face. "You don't even know who my father is." "You don't even know who your father is?" "How do I know?" Tang Ning asked in surprise. "How about you go back and ask your mother?" "Of course I know my father." The fat man said something, then he realized and said angrily, "You are scolding me." After he finished speaking, he sneered and said, "You picked it up, you know who your father is." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "My father's name is Zhong Mingli." "Zhong Mingli," the fat man was stunned. "What is this? I've never heard of it." Tang Ning looked behind the fat man and asked, "What is the crime for insulting an official of the imperial court?" "Wow." Peng Chen took out a string of iron chains from somewhere on his body and put them around the fat man's neck. He looked at the fat man who was stunned in place and said calmly, 20 sticks, depending on the severity of the crime, we will decide the sentence. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 40. Peng Chen is a very strange person. He actually carries an iron chain with him. Tang Ning wondered if this guy who always had a dead look on his face had any special hobbies. It's an iron chain, not a rope. This is a special hobby among special hobbies. The cold iron chain was wrapped around his neck, and the fat man was frightened. When he came in just now, he didn't notice the official in the yard. He was frightened and panicked. "I'm not guilty, what are you going to do?" Peng Chen looked at him and said expressionlessly, "You can save this sentence to tell Mr. Zhong. The crime of insulting an official of the imperial court, no matter how big or small, is definitely enough to scare people." I didn't mean to. I do not know." "Spare your life, my lord, spare your life." The fat man's face turned pale with fear. Peng Chen felt it was noisy and dragged him out. Peng Chen suddenly took out an iron chain. Not only the fat man was frightened, but also the man and the woman. The woman looked at Tang Ning, then at the door, and opened her mouth. "Xiaoning, this." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Next time he dares to cause trouble, go to the Yamen and sue him. If you arrest him a few times, he will become honest." The man said, "His father is Member Zheng. Will the Yamen arrest him for such a trivial matter?" "Don't be afraid, there is someone in our Yamen." Tang Ning smiled and said, "Don't say it's him, even his father can be caught." The man then remembered that Tang Ning's identity now was different from before. He was the uncle of the county magistrate's family, and he was no longer the Xiao Ning who was often bullied by that damn fat man. Thinking of this, he frowned again and asked, "What's going on between you and the county magistrate? You became his uncle, what will Xiru do?" "Third uncle." Suaryu hurriedly stepped forward and said, "Brother Xiaoning has been running all the way just now. Please let him go inside to rest first." The woman hurriedly took him into the house and said, Yes, Xiaoning, go inside first and have a drink of water." The man was about to enter the house when he was stopped by Suaryu. "Third uncle." Suaryu looked at him and said, "Don't mention this matter again in front of brother Xiaoning." "Why?" Sushan looked at her and asked doubtfully, "Why didn't you mention it?" "He said he would marry you after he passes the exam." "What does this mean now?" "Sister Zhong is beautiful, a talented woman, and has a good background. She is the perfect match for brother Xiaoning." Suaryu said with a smile on her face, "Actually, I have always regarded him as my elder brother." Sushan frowned and said, "I watched you grow up, do you think you can deceive me?" Suaryu shook her head and said, "Anyway, third uncle, don't force him anymore, as long as brother Xiaoning is fine." She seemed to have remembered something, and murmured again, "That piece of cloth is almost finished, and I will sell it tomorrow. He is in Zhouchang, and needs money in many places, and Xiaoning doesn't want to accept other people's favors in vain." Tang Ning sat in the room, slightly absent-minded. This room was very run-down, and the few pieces of furniture it had were old and out of shape. Although dilapidated, it is extremely familiar. It's not like he didn't hear what third uncle and Suaryu said just now. Although Suaryu and the former Tang Ning probably didn't have a marriage contract, they were obviously childhood sweethearts who were engaged in a lifelong private relationship. He is also Tang Ning, but not that Tang Ning, but others think he is that Tang Ning, and he cannot prove to others that he is not that Tang Ning. It sounds convoluted and silly, but it's the truth. Suaryu walked in from outside the door and said, "Brother Xiaoning, let me take you to see your old room." Tang Ning nodded. Suaryu lived next door to her third uncle's house, and as her family's child adopter, of course Tang Ning also lived there. This room was a little more run down than what Tang Ning had seen just now, but it was neater. After entering the house, Suaryu pointed to a room at the door and said, "This is my room." She pointed to the innermost room and said, "This is the room where brother Xiaoning used to live." Tang Ning opened the door curtain and went in. His room was even tidier. Facing the door was a bookcase with many books neatly placed on it. The familiar feeling in Tang Ning's heart became even stronger. He walked around the room, touched the bookcase, took down a few books from the bookcase, and leafed through them casually. It was obviously his first time coming to this place, but it seemed like he had experienced all this countless times. Seeing the look of memories on his face, Su Ryu looked expectant. Xiao Ryu Tang Ning suddenly looked back at her and asked, "What if I can't remember what happened before?" Even if brother Xiao Ning has forgotten everything, Su Ryu looked at him and said without any hesitation, "Brother Xiao Ning is also my brother Xiao Ning." Tang Ning smiled and said, "If you can't remember, can you tell me what happened in the past one by one?" Su Ryu nodded, her face regained a trace of rossiness, and said, "Of course." Tang Ning stayed in Sujiakan for more than an hour, and it was almost time. He looked at Su Ryu and said, "Recuperate at home and I'll come see you tomorrow." The third uncle looked at him expectantly and asked, "You really can't remember me, you even forgot my name." Tang Ning had really lost her previous memory of this body, otherwise, she wouldn't have been unable to recognize even Xiao Ryu. As for the third uncle's name, who would have thought that a grown man, tall and thick-set, would have such a feminine and cosmopolitan name as Susan? When Tang Ning and Peng Chen walked out, a fat middle-aged man came up to him, stuffed a small bag into Tang Ning's arms, and whispered, "Mr. Tang, Chang'er doesn't know Magistrate Zhong, and he didn't mean to offend, Your Excellency, you don't remember the villain's faults, so for the sake of our friendship over so many years, just let him go." Needless to say, this person should be that member Zheng. The third uncle had just told him that this boy named Zheng had been plotting against Xiao Ryu over the years and bullying him a lot. After so many years of friendship, he couldn't let him go. What's more, the little money he gave himself was not as good as the tips Tang Yaoyao gave to those doctors. Tang Ning looked at member Zheng and said, "Don't worry, considering the friendship we have had for so many years, if he gets beaten up, I will ask them to be gentler." He looked at Peng Chen and said, "Take it back." On the carriage, the fat man cried and said, Tang Ning, you can't do this. We played in the mud together when we were children, and I even lent you books." Tang Ning looked at him and suddenly asked, "Is it you?" The fat man wiped his tears. "Me, what am I?" He burst into tears, slapped himself hard several times, and cried, "I used to bully you all the time, it was my fault, I will never dare to do it again, please spare me, I will waive the rent for your family and my third uncle's family. I beg you, it hurts so much to hit the board. I don't want to go to the cell." The third uncle had actually told him just now that Fatty Zheng had always been interested in Xiao Ryu, and he and Tang Ning disliked each other. However, for so many years, they had always had verbal conflicts and never done anything excessive. Even over the land rent, it has never been difficult for them. The people who attacked him that day probably had nothing to do with him. He waved his hand and said, "Okay, you can go down. I'll let you go this time. If you bully Xiru again next time, let's settle the score together with this time." The fat man's face showed joy, he beat his chest loudly, and said with assurance, "Don't worry, whoever bullies Xiru in the future, I will ask my father to increase the rent of his house, and let my dog go to his dorpy." Tang Ning also dispelled her last doubts about the fat man. She waved her hand and said, "Go down." Peng Chen took off the iron chain around his neck and stopped the carriage. The fat man jumped out of the carriage nimbly and disappeared in a flash. Tang Ning leaned against the carriage with a look of helplessness on her face. He inherited Tang Ning's body and the debt he owed. He is no longer alone, and he can no longer just sit around and wait to die with such peace of mind.